Good morning. I'm Rob Fuquay, pastor here at St. Luke's, and along with the welcome you've already been given today, I want to welcome you. Thank you for joining us. We're halfway through a series called Out of the Wilderness, looking at stories from the early chapters of the book of Joshua. I want to start today thinking about rainbows. What do you think when you see a rainbow? Maybe a better question is, how do you feel when you see a rainbow? Do you feel happy? Do you feel encouraged? Do you feel hopeful? Rainbows have a way of catching our attention. In fact, when you see a rainbow and there are other people around, how many of you point it out to the other people? You don't just enjoy it yourself. You tell others, hey, look up, don't miss it. There's something about rainbows. We just can't keep it to ourselves. But it might be because they're not common. You don't see rainbows every day. I think it's more than that. I think there's something about rainbows that are uplifting to us, that are encouraging. And interestingly, rainbows usually appear at the end of a storm. So no wonder the ancient Jewish scribe telling the story of the great flood that lasted 40 days and 40 nights, imagined at the end of that storm the clouds parting and a rainbow appearing. And that writer took this natural phenomenon and turned it into a sign of God's promise that never again would God destroy the earth with a flood, so that for future generations to come, people who might have believed in a God of wrath, a God who was out to get them for all the bad things they had ever done, that every time they saw a rainbow, they would have something to hold on to. They would remember, God isn't out to get me, God is for me. They would remember good things. Now, as I mentioned, we're in a series looking at stories from the book of Joshua. Why would I begin today going all the way back to Genesis to talk about the rainbow story? And that is because the rainbow story connects with the first act committed by these Israelites who entered the promised land. They built a reminder because they recognize that in the spiritual life, we all need reminders of what we believe to be true. So today's story picks up right on the heels of where we left off last week, literally on the heels. The Israelites coming out of the wilderness arrive on the edge of the promised land, ready to enter, but they first must cross the Jordan River at flood stage. So Joshua tells them to follow behind the priests who are carrying the Ark of the Covenant. And the priests are to march straight into the raging waters. But as their feet touch the waters stop flowing. The river dries up. And the people pass through the parted waters safely on the other side. They now have their deliverance story. Think about that for a moment. This generation was born in the wilderness. How many times do you think they heard their parents tell them the story of the day they walked through the Red Sea that was miraculously parted under Moses? I can imagine every time they heard the story, they'd start rolling their eyes and mouthing the words right with their parents because they had heard it so many times. But now, they have their story to tell. They have their deliverance. It's important to have your own story to tell. So once they are safely through the river on the other side, Joshua tells one person from each of the 12 tribes to go back into the dry riverbed where the priests carrying the ark are still standing, and to go to that location and pick up a stone and bring it back and pile them up. Why? To be a memorial. So that in future generations, their children, their children's children, when they come to that place and they see the stones, they would say, what does this mean? What do these stones mean? And in that, they would serve as a sign, just like a rainbow. But what does this sign mean? What are the lessons meant to be taught to these future generations who would carry on this faith? Quite obviously, one of the lessons is that the people faced a great challenge there. They faced something very difficult, and it would make the simple point to their children and their children's children that life can be challenging. Life can be hard, but hard places are not necessarily bad places because God showed up there. And as they turned to God, they found a way forward. Imagine when they told their story to their children and children's children. Can't you imagine every time they told it, they would just embellish it a little bit more? Every time they told it, the Jordan River got a little bit wider. The raging waters got a little bit taller. Kind of like when you listen to your grandparents and they say how they had to walk 10 miles to school barefoot in the snow and it was uphill both ways. The point is not just that life can be hard, it's that you can survive hard things. That hard places can also be places where good things happen. We don't have to teach our children that life is hard. They're going to learn that on their own. But if we don't teach them that hard places can also produce good things, then all you have is hardness. And the hardness that's around you has a way of becoming the hardness inside of you. And the hardness of life can make you cynical and critical and pessimistic. Joe Pesci is an actor who has starred in a lot of hard movies. A lot of them are pretty violent, gangster related. But my favorite Joe Pesci movie is probably his least known. It's called With Honors. He plays a homeless man in Boston, a homeless man who crosses paths with a Harvard student, a student who has one last obstacle standing in the way of him and graduating with honors. The obstacle is a thesis paper. Right after printing a copy of the paper, his computer crashes. And the only existing copy he has is this printed version. So in a frantic, he gathers the paper to run to the library to print more copies. And on the way, he stumbles and the paper goes down a steam vent into a boiler room down below. So he finds his way down into the boiler room, and there is the homeless man, played by Joe Pesci. He's sitting by the boiler, reading the paper, and a page at a time, tossing it into the boiler, the only copy the student has. He screams, "Don't!" And so the homeless man makes a deal with him. He gives him a chapter at a time for gifts in exchange. This begins a relationship that starts with the Harvard student thinking this homeless person knows nothing. He's got nothing to offer him except his thesis paper. But as they get to know each other, he discovers that this homeless person becomes his most important teacher at school. Watch this scene as he gets one of his chapters back.
Here, chapter 2. I read it. That stuff is really coming out the wrong end, Harvard.
I'm sorry you didn't like it. This isn't just some term paper, you know. This is my life.
Your life is a bunch of papers?
I know it sounds pathetic, but my dream is to get into government and help people.
You think those ideas are going to help people? It's a bunch of pessimistic junk. That's not going to help. That's giving up.
Well, the best professor here happens to think that this has promise. His opinion, not yours. That's my life.
Wait a minute, Harvard. Let me show you my life. There it is. That's my life. I got this one on a beach in Bali. Best night's sleep I ever had.
You remember one night of sleep?
The last good one I had.
What's the shiny white one? Yeah, that one. What's that?
A woman.
Who was she?
The one. The one true love.
How about that? You're a romantic.
All quitters are romantic, Harvard. Yep. Each stone tells a story that I want to remember. All I do, put them in my hands and rub them. And abracadabra, I'm back there. Come on, give me your books.
I thought about that scene from this movie that I saw many, many years ago as I was working on the message today, because in building this memorial of stones, no doubt one of the lessons that is to be taught to future generations is when you have something good to hold on to in life, you remember that there is good in life, no matter who you are. No matter what you've been through, there are good things to hold on to in our lives, things that we don't want to let go of. What good things do you have to hold on to today? Hold on to that thought. We're going to come back to it in a moment. I want to go back to the Joshua story because I believe there's an even deeper lesson going on in this establishing of a sign of memorial stones. And another lesson is this, that provisions from God come when needed, not in advance. When the priest's feet touched the water, that is when the water stopped. That would be an important lesson to pass on to future generations, that God's provisions come when needed, not in advance. And that is an important reminder, because so often it's easy to want God to give us the answers to our problems before we ever get to the problems, to keep our needs out in front of us, knowing that they're going to be met. But God provides as our needs arise, not in advance. As the old saying goes, God may not show up when we want, but God is always right on time. That was the message to be taken from the manna in the wilderness. The people, when they were living in the wilderness, cried out to God when they were hungry. So God gave them manna. When they woke up in the morning, they would see out on the ground what looked like bread. And people were told to take a basket and go out and collect as much as they needed for their entire tent. But the caveat was for that day. They couldn't collect for tomorrow or the day after that. Just one day at a time. If they tried to hoard it, if they tried to collect in advance, it would rot, it would go bad. The lesson was that each day they will have what they need. Each day they will have what they need. The only manna that could be preserved that didn't rot was the manna designated by God to be put in a jar and placed in the tabernacle. Later, it would be taken to Jerusalem when the temple was built, and it would be put in the holy place as a perpetual reminder, long after the people left the wilderness, long after they came out of the wilderness, to remember a truth that goes on, that God provides for us each day as we need it, not in advance. as our problems are experienced. And you know, when we have something to point to, when we have something to hold on to that reminds us of that truth, we're less anxious about the future. We have a trust that God is looking out for us, and tomorrow God will show up and give us what we need. It gives us a peace. For this past year, my father-in-law has lived with us during the pandemic. He's back in Kansas right now for a little while. But my father-in-law is a brilliant man. He's very, very intelligent. But he doesn't remember things like he once did. And it's frustrating to him at times. I think there are times that he gets quite agitated, that he can't remember like he once did. And I noticed during this year that Susan would sometimes sit down with him and she would take out photo albums. And she would go through pictures of old family gatherings and events and remind her dad of where many of these things took place and what was being celebrated and what went on, and reminders of his ministry and things that he had done. And I noticed that whenever they would spend that kind of time together, he would always have a calm. He would always have a peace. You know, when you have something to hold on to, something that you just know that God has been in your past, that God shows up, it gives you a confidence, a hope about the future. What do you have to hold on to today? For many of us, we've come through a wilderness this year. We've come through some challenging times, but there have been good things that we don't want to leave behind in our race to get back to life as usual and all of the things we want to return to. There have been some things behind us that have happened in the difficult and in the bad that we don't want to lose. The Pew Center for Research did a study and found that 3 in 10 Americans report that their faith got stronger as a result of the pandemic. They talk about how the pandemic strengthened their relationship with God. And 4 in 10 people say that their family bonds got stronger as a result of the pandemic. What are things that you celebrate that you say, I don't want to leave that behind? I want to hold on to that. You know, here at St. Luke's, every week we get letter after letter after letter, most of the time from people who take a moment to write something down when they're sending their gift into the church to tell us about what they are grateful for. And person after person will write and talk about how online worship, Pastor Javon's mobile messages, the different classes that have been offered, the care calls that people have received. One after another, people will say, these have been life-saving for me. I'm just so grateful because that's how I've been able to get through this time. You hopefully, in preparation for the service today, got a rock. If you don't have one with you, then after the service, go and find a rock that you can use, because in a moment, you're going to be encouraged to write down on that rock what you hold on to in this season. Maybe it is something to do with your faith. Maybe it's something to do with your family. Maybe it's something that you know and believe has made you a stronger person. Maybe you've been able to overcome something during this pandemic. Many people have said that even in the losses that they've experienced, they look back now and they just have such a new level of appreciation for the resources God provided, for the people God provided in their lives to help them get through that time. What's on your rock? as you think about that, let me point out one final thing. That when we have something good to hold on to, it summons something within us. It calls forth something out of us. When we have good things to hold on to, we recognize that we have good things to pass along to others. About 6 months before the outbreak of COVID-19, the president of Ireland gave an address to a gathering in which he recalled the Spanish flu, which happened a century ago, 100 years ago, the worst pandemic in history. The Spanish flu killed 50 to 100 million people worldwide, and the reason that number is so vague is the records are so inaccurate to know exactly how many died. We believe it was close to 700,000 people in the United States. The president of Ireland gave an address to talk about the importance of remembering. In the address, he asked the question, why do some major historical events occupy the forefront of the collective consciousness while profound moments, such as the pandemic we're discussing today, sometimes stand distantly behind? And then it's as if he answers his question through more questions. He says, in what ways does the duty of memory summon us to do justice to the dead? To what extent are we to allow ourselves to be changed as we listen to the narrative of the other? What is the relationship between memory and history? These are first-order moral questions. You know, when we recognize in our lives that, yes, we have survived something, we have gotten through something, but you know what? We've not gotten through it alone. Who are we to fool ourselves? It's by God's hand that we are where we are. We are people who are blessed. We have something to hold on to. It summons something from us. It calls forth from us a desire to be people who pass along good things for others to hold on to. Recently, Indiana icon Bobby "Slick" Leonard passed away. His funeral was just a few days ago at Carmel United Methodist Church, and a lot of basketball greats from history came to pay tribute. One of those was George McGinnis. George McGinnis spoke at the funeral. He shared how when he was a senior in high school, his father died. And how later, as he got to know Bobby Leonard, Leonard became like an adopted father to him. He said of all of the lessons that Bobby Leonard taught him, the one that will never leave him, the one that stands out, was on his second day with the Indiana Pacers. Slick Leonard said to him, "You are nobody until you do something for somebody else." He said he'll never forget that. He becomes somebody when he does something for somebody else. He has always held onto that. No matter who you are, no matter what you've been through, you always can be somebody for somebody else.